Do you skip over parts of a contract that look like the standard wording? Well, in many cases, it's these so-called boilerplate clauses that protect you when things don't go to plan, or that can expose you if they're not addressed properly in the contract. I'm Mike, founder of Starlit Contracts. We are here to help you negotiate and use contracts with confidence. And today we're looking at boilerplate clauses. Now let's get into it. To summarize, boilerplate clauses are a category of clause that you find in a contract. Now, I've never seen a contract which had a section called boilerplate clauses. Rather, this term is used to identify clauses that you'll find in many different types of contracts in a similar format in many countries around the world. Typical examples of boilerplate clauses are the confidentiality and force majeure clauses. So how do such clauses work in practice? Contracts are typically divided into boilerplate clauses and deal-specific clauses. The benefit of boilerplate clauses is that they are well known in the market and have been tested by the courts. This means that it's often clear how such a clause would be interpreted by a court or applied in practice if there was a dispute. Is this something that you should care about? Well, a bit like all clauses, it really depends if you need the clause during implementation of a deal. But since we can't look into a crystal ball and know what the future will hold, the inclusion of boilerplate clauses generally do no harm, provided they follow the standard language. Now keep in mind that if you remove a boilerplate clause during the negotiation phase and then want to introduce it later through a contract amendment, then that could be a lot harder. You will not necessarily be able to add the clause later unless the other party agrees to it. Let's look at a practical example together. Steve removed the boilerplate confidentiality clause from his contract template to make it shorter and more customer-friendly. This is a common scenario. People feel that by shortening the contract, they'll make the entire contracting process easier and reduce the complexity of the deal overall. But let's see what happens. He signed a contract with a customer, then realized that he needs to send them sensitive information to complete his obligations. Steve does not want the customer to share it. So what could go right for Steve in this situation? Let's say that he speaks with the customer and explains the situation. If Steve has a good relationship with the customer, or the customer is otherwise willing to address Steve's concerns, then they might say, "Okay, Steve, let's amend the contract between us to include a confidentiality clause, or let's sign a non-disclosure agreement." This arrangement would typically limit the way in which the customer can use Steve's sensitive information. Alternatively, Steve and the customer might agree that Steve can perform his contractual obligations without sharing any sensitive information, or with some reduction to the price or change to the scope of work. Now let's look at what could go wrong for Steve in this situation. Let's say that Steve does not have a good relationship with the customer, or that the customer does not want to find a solution. The customer might say to Steve, "Well, hang on, Steve. You have a contractual obligation to send us information that you now say is sensitive. Our intention was to use that information without any restrictions. That is why we accepted a higher price. So, Steve, if you don't send us that information, then you'll be in breach of contract and will have the right to make a claim against you." Let's look at some key considerations when deciding how to use boilerplate clauses. First, consider if you need a particular boilerplate clause based on the specifics of your deal. Think about these two scenarios. First, let's say that you're a supplier with an online shop. Customers visit your website, and if they want to purchase your product, then they pay and download the product immediately. This is a very different situation to a supplier who must go to a customer's site to perform maintenance over an extended period of time, and who gets paid when the work is done. Now, when you look at these two scenarios side by side, we can see that the potential benefit of having a boilerplate force majeure clause is different. The intention of a force majeure clause is to give a supplier cost and time relief if there's a so-called act of God, like flooding, or in case of war or some unforeseeable event. When you think about the specifics of your deal, you might decide that a force majeure clause is unlikely to be needed and remove it altogether, or use a shorter version. But remember, when deciding if to keep or delete a boilerplate clause, take into consideration how you would like to work with the other party in future. Keep in mind that the negotiation phase can be difficult and time-consuming. So many people will reuse their prior agreements, even if the old contract doesn't address the specifics of the new deal. So when you're negotiating a contract with a supplier or customer, especially if it's your first contract with them, think about how your relationship might change, and if it would be a good idea to include certain boilerplate clauses in case they're needed later. Finally, whilst boilerplate clauses can be very important to a deal, more time should be spent on the top priority topics, including where disagreements are most common. For example, making the scope of work clear and getting the payment mechanism, caps on liability and exclusions of liability right. To summarize our key takeaways, boilerplate clauses are generally helpful as they address common contractual topics clearly and reduce the likelihood of the parties disagreeing about how to apply that part of the contract. Given this, consider carefully whether the specifics of your deal mean that it's desirable to have a boilerplate clause now or potentially in future. Keep in mind too that the negotiation of your top contractual priorities like payment provisions, limitations and exclusions of liability, and the scope of work should be prioritized over boilerplate clauses. If you're ready to take your next step to negotiate and use contracts with confidence, then visit us at _contracts.com, where you can access more content, participate in interactive sessions, and be part of our community. I look forward to seeing you there.